Right now, if it rains for a week straight, you're mildly annoyed. Maybe your plans get canceled. Maybe you complain about it online and wait it out under a roof that never once considers failing. For most of human history, a week of solid rain wasn't an inconvenience. It was one of the most dangerous stretches your ancestors could face. No roof that actually worked, no dry firewood, no way to check a forecast and prepare. Just water. For days, with no guarantee the week wouldn't turn into two. So what did they actually do? Start with the most immediate problem: fire. Fire wasn't optional. It cooked food, kept predators away, and was often the only thing standing between your ancestors and hypothermia. And fire hates water. Green wood doesn't burn, wet kindling doesn't catch, no matter how long you hold a spark to it. Early humans solved this the same way modern survivalists still do. They stockpiled dry tinder inside caves and rock shelters long before the rain arrived, storing it high and dry specifically for stretches like this. Archaeological sites across Europe and Africa show exactly this pattern. Dense concentrations of charcoal and ash layered deep inside cave interiors, far from the entrance, in spots that would have stayed dry through a downpour. A rainy week wasn't something you improvised through. It was something you prepared for in advance. The same way you'd stock a pantry, and the people who hadn't prepared learned that lesson exactly once. Shelter mattered even more. Most people picture a caveman living in one enormous cave, but real archaeological evidence tells a messier story. Rock overhangs, shallow shelters, and lean-tos built from branches and hide were far more common than deep caves, and none of them were naturally waterproof. Excavations at sites like Abri-Pataude in France show layers of packed clay and ash deliberately laid down along shelter floors. Early, crude waterproofing built by people who'd clearly learned the hard way that a wet floor meant a miserable, potentially fatal night. Hide coverings were tied down at the edges with cordage made from plant fiber or sinew, creating something close to a tent flap centuries before anyone had a word for tent. Bedding mattered just as much as walls. Dry grass, moss, and layered hides weren't comfort items. They were insulation between a sleeping body and cold, damp ground, and losing that layer to a leak could turn an uncomfortable night into a dangerous one. But even good shelter didn't eliminate the biggest threat: cold. Hypothermia doesn't require freezing temperatures. It just requires you to be wet, still, and unprotected for long enough. And a week of rain is exactly that scenario, stretched out. This is very likely one of the real reasons early humans huddled together in tight groups during bad weather. Not just for warmth, but because shared body heat in an enclosed shelter could be the difference between surviving the week and not. Group size mattered. A single person alone in a wet shelter faced a real risk. 6 or 7 people packed into the same space had a dramatically better shot. Then there was food. A week of rain meant no hunting trips across open, exposed terrain, and often no fishing either, since heavy rain muddies rivers and scatters fish. This is where stored food became critical. Evidence from sites in the Dordogne region shows early humans processing and drying meat well before it was needed, creating something close to primitive jerky that could survive days without a fresh kill. Nuts, dried tubers, and preserved fat were rationed out during exactly these kinds of forced pauses. In a strange way, bad weather is one of the reasons food storage was invented in the first place. You don't need to preserve food if every day is huntable. You very much do if 1 week in 5 isn't. Rain also brought quieter dangers, the kind that don't show up in one dramatic night but build slowly across a week. Constant dampness meant skin problems, infected cuts, and fungal issues that modern people barely think about, but that could genuinely disable someone without antibiotics. Some researchers point to evidence of early plant-based treatments, certain barks and resins with antimicrobial properties, used specifically on wounds during wet seasons, suggesting this wasn't a minor annoyance but a recurring problem worth solving. Then there was the boredom. The part almost nobody talks about. A week trapped inside a shelter with nothing to hunt, nowhere to go, and no forecast telling you when it would end is a very specific kind of psychological pressure. And the evidence suggests early humans didn't just sit there. This is very likely where a huge amount of early toolmaking, ornament crafting, and even some of the earliest known art actually happened. Confined, idle hours inside a shelter are an excellent environment for repetitive, detailed work: carving, shaping, experimenting. Some researchers studying sites with dense clusters of finely made tools and decorative items have proposed exactly this. Bad weather may have been one of the quiet engines behind early human craftsmanship, simply by forcing people to sit still with their hands free for days at a time. There's also a darker side. Prolonged rain caused real flooding, and low-lying campsites near rivers were sometimes abandoned entirely after repeated flood damage. Archaeologists can actually see this in the layered soil at certain sites, alternating bands of habitation debris and pure flood sediment, showing a camp used, flooded, and reused again years later. Choosing where to live wasn't just about proximity to water and game, it was also, quietly, a long-running lesson in exactly how far the water could reach, one some groups apparently had to relearn more than once. And when the rain finally broke, the week wasn't simply over. Waterlogged ground made travel and hunting difficult for days afterward. Stored food had to be checked for spoilage. Shelters needed re-waterproofing before the next storm because there was always a next storm. Recovery was its own quiet phase of the cycle, rarely dramatic enough to leave obvious traces, but very likely just as constant as the rain itself. So, the next time a week of rain ruins your plans, consider what the same week meant 100,000 years ago. Rationed food, huddled bodies, hoarded dry wood, treated wounds, and hours of idle hands, slowly inventing the tools and art that would eventually become civilization. Nothing about it was passive. Every dry patch of tinder, every strip of dried meat, every scrap of waterproofed hide floor was a decision made in advance by people who understood something we've mostly forgotten, that the weather doesn't wait for you to be ready.